For those of you who might be visiting our service for the first time, let me give you just a little bit of background. From time to time, usually 3 or 4 times a year, instead of a sermon that I deliver from the pulpit, we offer a conversation of faith. And the point of this conversation of faith is to invite someone who is a thought leader in our city or in our nation, and we explore some of those important ideas in that particular field. Today, I am grateful to have as our guest Sam Harris. Sam is a celebrated writer, podcaster, scientist, and someone who has also been critical of religion. I've read many of his books, and I always find them engaging and challenging. So to put it bluntly, we have one of the nation's leading atheists inside one of the nation's leading churches. What could go wrong this morning? Would you please welcome Sam Harris? Welcome, Sam. Sam, it is so good to be with you today. And for those of you, for those who might not be familiar with some of your work, why don't you just give us a little bit of a brief background in terms of who you are and what you're doing at this point in your life?
Sure. Well, first, thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. This is not how I normally spend my Sunday, as you might imagine. But it's beautiful. There's nothing in my work that suggests that that I or any other atheist can't love beautiful buildings and a conscious effort to seek profundity in the present moment. And so music and ritual and many of the aspects of this service precisely are things that really resonate with me. And it's an irony that I wrote this first book, The End of Faith, which again was as you mentioned, a kind of frontal assault on religious faith and the notion of revelation and organized religion and religious sectarianism. But I never thought of myself as an atheist. I never used the word atheism in the book. I had no knowledge of the atheist community, or I don't think I could have told you who Madalyn Murray O'Hair was at that point. And all I was arguing for was reason and evidence and common sense and just a frank acknowledgement that religion, because we have these competing dogmatisms, these competing sects, these competing claims of the unique veracity of revelations. At minimum, you have Christians and Jews and Muslims. I thought religion had shattered our world quite unnecessarily into these warring moral camps. And my first book, The End of Faith, was a direct response to the events of 9/11. So I was in the middle of my PhD in neuroscience, where I was studying belief. I was actually scanning people's brains and studying the difference between believing and disbelieving various propositions, religious and otherwise, mathematical, logical, historical. And then people started flying planes into our buildings for transparently religious reasons, with an expectation of paradise that they will tell you about ad nauseum. And so then I took a detour from my scientific studies at that point and wrote this first book that was very much against faith. And I finally went back and touched other topics, but that's how I got here.
Very good. So the thing that interests me today is that after that book, you went on and wrote a book titled Waking Up, which I found really fascinating, and it's a wonderful book. I recommend it to you. But not to oversimplify it, but the thesis is basically this, that in one way or another, a spiritual life is important to our humanity. And so I'd like for you to talk a little bit in terms of why you wrote that book and why you think, in a way, spirituality is important to who we are as human beings.
Well, there are many ways into that. I guess, the most common is to recognize that we all suffer and we're all going to die. Even if you are the luckiest person you have ever met and you live longer than anyone, eventually your phone will start ringing with all the bad news of the people you love who are dying and disappearing. And that fundamental mystery that we all have to confront, that this life is impermanent, and that even when we have everything we want, or nearly everything we want, even when we're not sick and no one around us who we love is sick, still there's this constant undercurrent of dissatisfaction. It's hard, even when you're getting what you want, in the very act of gratifying a desire, your contact with your direct experience is still less than perfectly satisfying. In fact, your pleasures just recede. I mean, you get this the bite of the perfect food that you want. That chocolate cake or whatever it is that you've been looking forward to, and even in the act of savoring it, in the next moment it's a little too much and you need a drink of water, right? I mean, you wouldn't want that experience itself to persist forever. And so there's this search for happiness in a context that seems perfectly designed to frustrate that search. And so I view spirituality as a way of answering this question of whether it's possible to be truly happy and truly peaceful and to connect with a durable form of well-being before anything happens, before you get what you desire, even in the midst of physical pain or disappointment or anything conventionally negative.
I appreciate what you're saying, because I'll attribute this to one of my dear friends. He passed away a few years ago, but Dr. Forrest Church, who was the senior minister in All Souls Church in New York City, he once said that religion is about trying to make sense of two stubborn facts. One is that we are born, and none of us chose to be born, and then we're all going to die. And so somehow or another, in between, we're here and it's going to end. Religion, in some ways, is trying to make sense of that. I think the spiritual quest is trying to make sense of that. And it may not give us all the answers we want. There's still a lot of unknown and a lot of mystery. But there is something, I think, profoundly true about this, the transitory quality of life. And it's here and it ends. And so we struggle with that. But I want to come back to the idea of spiritual practice. I know that meditation has been important to you. I think people are always interested to know, why is that particular spiritual practice important? What do you get out of it? And how do you incorporate it into a very busy life?
Well, there are many different kinds of meditation. The kind I've done is traditionally a Buddhist practice that many people know of as mindfulness now. And one of the reasons why mindfulness is so popular and why it's been so easily exported into the scientific community, and there are many neuroscience labs studying it now, is that there's really nothing associated with it that is prototypically religious. There's no iconography to be interested in. You don't have to even care about Buddhism or the Buddha. I mean, it's almost perfectly designed for export into a secular context, and that's why, unlike various Hindu practices where you're repeating a mantra, or you're adding something to your experience that is susceptible to doubt. I mean, if you're an atheist and you're being told to chant to Krishna, you can get sidetracked, wondering, why am I talking to the Hindu god of love, and does he exist, and do I even want to know about him if he does exist? So mindfulness is just the act of paying very careful attention to the present moment, just noticing what you notice in each moment, whether it's a sensation in the body or a thought arising or a mood, and you're not trying to control your experience. You're not trying to even, paradoxically, you're not even trying to improve your experience. You're simply trying to notice the flow of consciousness and its contents in each moment. And what happens when you do that in a very systematic way, and I've done this on retreat, where you go into silence for weeks or even months at a time, and there are people who do this for years at a time. I've met people who've spent decades on silent retreat. It's an amazing fact that simply paying attention to experience is an antidote to the problems I just described. This feeling of dissatisfaction, this feeling of seeking happiness and having that search itself become toxic. And you can uncover in merely witnessing experience the fact that consciousness itself has an intrinsic quality of well-being, that which is aware of sadness isn't truly sad, and that which is aware of joy is the same thing as that which is aware of sadness. And so you can keep falling back into that position of merely witnessing, and that can become very, very expansive, and that can become a context of a kind of self-transcending love and happiness.
Yeah, it seems to me that, from a religious perspective at least, that I think some people see religion as an escape from what's really happening in their lives. Whereas my perspective would be religion is actually about trying to help us move more deeply into what is actually happening in our lives. And so this sense of mindfulness, whether it's mindfulness, whether we call it prayerfulness, whether we call it awareness, it's not something that's just been invented recently. I mean, almost all of the great world's religions accentuate this in one way or another. I think of that little book that was written by Thich Nhat Hanh a few years ago, Living Buddha, Living Christ. And in both of those books, he talks about how both the Buddha and the Christ put this great deal of emphasis upon the mindful experience and how transforming it can be. So mindfulness is having a good moment right now in our culture,
yes.
and I think that's a good thing. But it also goes back centuries, of course, and I think that's an interesting thing too.
Yeah, it's having a superficial moment. It's almost by definition having a big moment is to have a kind of shallow one as well. And so many people are engaging it as though it were some glorified version of an executive stress ball, where it's just optimizing performance. And it's quite a bit deeper than that. And yeah, as you say, it's thousands of years old.
So I'm also wondering in terms of, so meditation can be one experience, but are there other kinds of life rituals or spiritual rituals that you think of that actually have the capacity to enhance our depth as human beings?
Well, I certainly think there should be. I mean, it's inconvenient for me as an atheist that when someone dies, or when someone comes time to get married, or when you're looking for a rite of passage for your 13-year-old to experience, the only ready-made rituals and frameworks for that are religious in some form. So if you're Jewish or you are an atheist, but you grow up in the Jewish tradition, there is no one to call but a rabbi when those moments come, and I'm sure it's the same for Christians. That I think we need. I think we need to transcend sectarianism ultimately. I think whatever is to be discovered in the present moment that's profound is by definition non-denominational. I think that the truth is deeper than any of our traditions, and I think ultimately, and this is where you and I probably disagree about some things, I think ultimately we have to get out of the religion business as it's been practiced for thousands of years, and we have to find a language that is truly global and truly transcends the accidents of birth. It can't be that by virtue of birth, people in India or Mongolia don't have access to the truth that can be realized in the present moment. And so whatever rituals we have that frame these moments in life that are profound and I think need to be framed in a way that separates them from the rest of our superficiality. I mean, just the fact that you and I aren't checking our cell phones now is important, right? And I think we need beautiful buildings, and we need moments in life where we engage our ethical depth and what's most important to us, whether it's community or the transience of life or our hopes for our children, whatever it is. There's more than what we tend to access in our superficiality. But I think 1,000 years from now, or even 100, we need to find a moment where we have left our sectarianism behind. And so that, I view the secular project as being that ultimately.
Yeah, I think where I would come from with it is that, well, first of all, I will say that we all know that there's sort of a good practice of religion and a really bad practice of religion. Yeah. And when religion is bad, it's really bad, and it can be damaging, and it's caused many atrocities to the human family. And I think anybody who has any form of religious faith, in a sense, has to own up to that and be honest about that. On the other hand, what I would say is that when one really begins to understand that religion is not trying to point in and of itself to itself, it is trying to point to something beyond itself, something that I think is deeply human, deeply universal, and that can be deeply healing to the human family. And so, the point of, for example, in our church when we take the Holy Eucharist, the point is not to see how many people we can get to sip the cup and eat the bread. The point is that the Eucharist is pointing us to something. It's pointing us to the fact that as the human family, we always need to make room for one more, that we always need to find a way to share, that we need justice for all of God's children, all human beings, wherever they might be. And so the ritual of the Eucharist, in my way of thinking, is important, but it's only important as it points us to that deeper truth that is this larger human truth that we're grappling with. So I say that, but I also have a question about it. If one thinks meditation's important and one thinks prayer's important, or if one thinks the ritual of a family dinner is important, but another thinks sharing the Passover or the Eucharist is important, or if somebody thinks some other kind of practice that is similar, one person may put a non-God grid over that practice and ritual and say it's important. Another group of people may take a God grid and put over that practice and ritual. They think it's important. In the end, does it matter if I'm using that grid of God or somebody is using a non-grid of God to apply over it? Isn't what really matters that we're all moving toward these deeper human structures that provide meaning for our lives? I'm not sure there's a question there. I think there are about 10 questions there, but I'd like for you to talk about that a little bit. You see what I'm asking?
Well, I think beliefs matter, and I think the methodology we use to vet beliefs matters. I think honesty matters. I think living within some framework where you feel like you need to deceive yourself or to deceive your children, that's intrinsically toxic. And insofar as that has been traditionally associated with religion, I think that's one of the problems. I think in my view, all we have is human conversation by which to vet various propositions. And to be a fundamentalist, say, is to be someone who locates the most profound conversation in a book that was written centuries or thousands of years ago, depending on the book, and you're then captive to that conversation, and then you have to squint your eyes and cock your head and figure out how to read Leviticus and Deuteronomy in a way that's benign, that doesn't have you killing your neighbor for working on the Sabbath, say. And I view that project as a problem because the fundamentalist has the advantage of saying, listen, I understand you have some highfalutin and overeducated interpretation of this, but I just want to read the words as they are on the page and read them as simply and honestly as I can. And if I'm a Muslim and I read the Quran and the Hadith as simply and honestly and as comprehensively as I can, I get something pretty close to ISIS, right? I get something that where jihad is not just an inner spiritual struggle, it is holy war against the infidel, right? And that And I spent a lot of time arguing for the need for reform in the Muslim world, and I think, and this is another thing, this is another place where I differ from many atheists. I think we have to acknowledge that our religions are different, and to be opposed to irrational belief as an atheist is not to be equally opposed to Anglicanism and Salafi Islam. I mean, they're completely different projects in terms of what they're committed to. But I think how we vet beliefs is important, and the problem for me with dogmatism, the dogma being believing something, at least in my mind, on insufficient evidence, or just asserting the truth of something which you actually can't verify. The problem there is that even very benign dogmas can have surprisingly negative consequences, and you can never really be sure what the consequences of a dogma will be until they suddenly ambush you. And my favorite example here is the dogma that it's kind of a twin dogma, that life starts at the moment of conception and that all human life is sacred. Right? Now this, on its face, these two beliefs seem like the most benign beliefs you could possibly have. I mean, what mischief are you going to get into if you think that all human life is sacred and that human life starts at the moment of conception? But that was precisely the belief system that gave us a fundamental opposition to embryonic stem cell research. Now, it looks like in the medical community we found a way, after some decades, we found kind of a workaround there, but it is a fact that for the better part of a generation, we dragged our feet on this research, which held extraordinary promise for delivering medical therapy for dozens of conditions. And yet we had people arguing that there were souls in petri dishes which you literally could not see. I mean, a single fertilized ovum is something that you could not see, sure, even if you had 1,000 on the palm of your hand. That these cells need to be privileged ethically over the medical therapy that could save, a child with full body burns, or a person with Parkinson's, or at least potentially. And that struck me as a moment of moral blindness that was only possible on the basis of this dogmatic idea about the emergence of souls at the moment of conception. Again, that was based on not a dogma like, kill the infidel wherever you find him, which is another, sure, kind of religious dogma we have, but the most benign possible dogma, that all human life is sacred.
So it seems to me that one thing that you're pointing toward, and I think is very important for every faith, not every faith practices it as well as I would like for it to, including my own, but it is that there is this critical principle of self-criticism. And I think that every religion has a moral obligation to be honest about what it knows and doesn't know, and to always have critical awareness. So that's one thing. And I think that sometimes my sense is, whether it's Christians or Jews or whoever it might be, sometimes people are afraid that if they are honest with their faith in a self-critical way, that it will diminish their faith. And my sense is, it doesn't have to diminish it. It may change it, but it doesn't have to diminish it. That's one thing. The second thing, though, that I think is very important is, just as science has evolved over the course of centuries, religious faith also has evolved over centuries. Now, sometimes people who are more fundamentalist, and let's face it, they're basically fundamentalists associated with every world religion. But also within most world religions, there is that group of people who understand that an evolving faith and a dynamic faith is critically important. And so it just seems to me that just as science evolves, religion also needs to evolve. And the fact that we see both as dynamic can be a very positive thing. So,
Yeah, well, you and I totally agree there. And I think that is, for me, the only thing that guarantees the open-endedness of our collaboration with one another. I mean, what will allow 7 billion of us, or 9 billion of us, or 12 billion of us, strangers, to collaborate in an open-ended way? It is the willingness to keep talking. It's the willingness to keep the conversation evolving, and that I think is...
Yeah, I mean, for example, you're talking about stem cell research and when life begins, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I can point to chairs of Christian theology, ethical theology, that are shared within divinity schools and medical schools as people are grappling with this. And so, yes, I think a dogmatic approach to religion, and frankly a dogmatic approach to just about anything, makes the world more dangerous because it makes the world smaller. But there are people who share both an honor of science and an honor of religion that are really grappling with some of these things, and I think that's a very positive thing. I want to come back around, though, to this sense of spiritual practice, because almost every psychology has in mind this idea of the self, that we sometimes talk about, being true to ourselves, or what is the deepest self. We try to make distinctions between a false self and a true self. And I'm wondering, in terms of your understanding, given what's going on in neuroscience, given what's going on in brain research, how do you understand this sense of agency, or this sense of self that human beings possess? And what do we do to deepen that sense of self in our human development?
Well, the term self can refer to many different things, and
Right.
so it can be confusing to talk about. The way I talk about the self is one where, I mean, the punchline is that our conventional sense of self is an illusion, and it's an illusion that that you can sort of cut through neuroanatomically when you just look in the brain. I mean, there's no place in the brain for a unitary self to be hiding. There's no one place in the brain where everything comes together, where there's a rider on the horse of consciousness who can appropriate everything in experience. That's just anatomically, that doesn't make sense. But as a matter of direct first-person experience, I also think it doesn't make sense. I think this, and when you interrogate this sense of self through a technique like meditation, it can fall away. And what you're left with is not that you disappear, it's not that the world disappears, but there's something that does disappear, and you're better off without it. And it's this feeling that most people have of being located in their heads. So most people don't feel identical with their bodies. If you just take stock of your experience right now, you don't feel identical with your body. You very likely feel like you have a body, that you are up in the head, and you're kind of riding around in your body like it's a vehicle, and your hands are down there, and if you close your eyes and you try to meditate, you try to pay attention, you're starting from this place of being a kind of a locus of consciousness or subjectivity in the head, behind the eyes, and then you're trying to aim your attention at, I mean, if your practice is to follow the breath, say, you're trying to aim your attention down at the breath, and the place you're aiming from, the sense that you're located in the head, is also the feeling of that you are the thinker of your thoughts. That there's a thinker in addition to the next thought that arises. That is not only do thoughts arise in consciousness, but you feel like you're the one who they're arising to, right? You're the kind of the man in the boat riding the river of consciousness, right? Whereas there really is just the river. There is no boat bobbing on the river. There is just the flow of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking, and just all of the energy that is arising in this moment in consciousness. And the world, anything you can call a world, is part of that as a matter of experience.
So are we transcending world or becoming one with it?
Well, ultimately, I don't think there is a difference. I think it's the sense that you're on the edge of the world, looking at it. Behind your face. Your face is a kind of mask, and you're behind it, and then there's the world. that can break down. If you look closely enough at that, that can drop away, and then on some level there's just the world. And it's not a claim about the metaphysics. It's not a claim that the universe is made of consciousness, say, but yeah, I'm kind of agnostic as to what the relationship between consciousness and the physics of the world is, and we certainly don't understand it at this point. But as a matter of experience, there is just consciousness and its contents, and everything you can experience in the present moment, whether it's the deepest love for Christ you've ever felt, or terror that you just saw a bear escape from the zoo and now you're running, right? Whatever the character of the experience, it is just consciousness and its contents. And the sense that there's a center to that, the sense that there's an ego in the middle of it, a self in the middle of it, that is vulnerable to inspection. And
Yes.
and I view every spiritual career ultimately, even explicitly religious ones, Christian ones or Sufi ones or Hindu ones, moments of self-transcendence have this character of losing the sense of being separate from the world, losing the sense of being separate from your experience. And that's just that's the way consciousness is intrinsically. It takes some work to recognize it to be such.
Okay, I'm going to have to meditate on all of
Yeah,
that, okay?
yeah,
So I
okay.
thank you. That was excellent. So, Sam, I want to end by asking this question. I just finished reading this new book by Toni Morrison last week, in which she uses the word othering. Mm-hmm. And she talks about how that what happens sometimes is that we turn the other into the stranger, into the enemy. And we other others because we're trying to normalize ourselves. Mm. And so I'm wondering, from your perspective, what would you like for people of faith to understand about people who are not people of faith? And then I'll try to do the flip side of that. What would you like for us to know about people who don't believe in God?
Well, this is a line that some atheist came up with. I actually forgot who this was attributed to. Not a famous one, but he simply pointed out that when talking to any person of faith, the atheist is always in a position to say that you know exactly what it's like to be an atheist. I mean, so for instance, you're a Christian. You know exactly what it's like not to believe that the Quran is the perfect word of the creator of the universe. Right? And you know exactly what it's like not to lose sleep over whether or not you should convert to Islam, right? And you know that feeling for 1,000 other gods, right? You know what it's like not to care about Zeus or to think that Zeus needs to be in just the mythology section of the bookstore. You know what it's like not to be a Mormon, and ad infinitum. The atheist is simply in that position with respect to one more God and one more faith tradition. And so there really is, 99% of my experience would be deeply familiar to you, and in conversation with any other, faith tradition.
I appreciate that. And I think what I would want to say is that for those who don't believe, and they sometimes take a peek at people of faith, that first of all, there are a lot of people of faith who hold their faith very sincerely, and they try to also hold that faith intelligently. And they're also trying to grow and expanding not just their feeling about something, but their understanding about something. Mm-hmm. And I think that if there's anything that can come out of this conversation today, my hope is this, that for those of us who believe, and perhaps those who don't believe, that there's a way for us to do less othering and building bridges of understanding. And so I just want to say it's been a real honor to have you at First Congregational Church today.
Likewise.
Thank you.
Thank you.